Why do we choose controversial leaders? The question of why a controversial figure like Donald Trump might win a presidential election, despite his politics, legal issues, history with women, and instances of racial rhetoric, is both fascinating and complex. Many people see these factors as disqualifying, yet millions still find reasons to support him. To fully understand this, we need to look at the diverse social, psychological, and political factors that can drive support for polarizing leaders. In today's world, politics is shaped not only by policies, but also by identity, economic anxiety, media influence, and cultural divides. Support for leaders like Trump doesn't happen in a vacuum. It reflects wider dynamics and deep-seated frustrations that affect many voters. Whether it's a distrust of traditional politics, frustration with economic inequality, a desire for a strongman leader, or a rejection of certain cultural shifts, each of these factors can create a path for controversial figures to rise to power. This analysis explores reasons why Trump, a divisive candidate, might win an election, revealing the powerful and sometimes surprising influences that shape political outcomes. By examining these reasons, we gain insight into how polarized societies navigate challenging choices and why, in times of uncertainty, many voters are drawn to candidates who promise to disrupt the status quo. In a world increasingly divided, it seems like we're constantly drawn to figures who embody our strongest beliefs and our deepest frustrations. Society isn't just polarized, it's fractured into echo chambers amplified by social media, where we only hear what we already believe. The algorithms play to our biases, reinforcing our convictions and magnifying our loyalty to those who embody our chosen side, no matter how extreme they may seem. It's no surprise, then, that many of us are fed up with traditional politics. After years of seeing the same promises repeated and broken, there's a growing hunger for something radically different. Enter the populists, those figures who don't just offer change but promise to turn the whole system upside down. They speak simply, directly, without the polished evasiveness of career politicians. And for those who feel ignored, this directness is a breath of fresh air. The media, meanwhile, can't resist a polarizing figure. Every soundbite, every scandal, every controversy becomes another headline, another segment. Love them or hate them, controversial leaders are always in the spotlight, their visibility constantly stoked by the very channels that claim to hold them accountable. And for those who feel disillusioned with the status quo, who see the political establishment as a self-serving machine, these leaders feel like the antidote. There's also something to be said for strength, or at least the perception of it. In uncertain times, many of us look for a leader who projects power, a strongman who seems unshaken by the complexities of modern governance. This perceived strength, real or not, becomes a beacon for those who want stability in a chaotic world. Add to that the pull of nostalgia. When leaders promise to bring back a better time, they tap into a yearning for a world that, in memory at least, felt simpler and more secure. And let's face it, some people feel exhausted by the demands of political correctness, viewing it as a stifling force on everyday conversation and behavior. A leader who's willing to reject those cultural restraints can be incredibly appealing for those who feel like society has gone too far. Finally, there's economic anxiety, a force as old as politics itself. When people feel financial insecurity, they want someone who promises stability and reform, a leader who seems to understand their struggles and vows to fix them. And in this whirlwind of social media, sensationalism, nostalgia, and economic pressure, the stage is set. All of these factors collide, creating fertile ground for the rise of leaders who don't just sit at the center, but thrive at the extremes, feeding off the discontent and channeling it into a movement that feels, to many, like the only hope for radical change. Political and cultural factors such as social media, media sensationalism, and economic anxiety can create an environment that favors controversial leaders who promise radical change. Let's examine some of these: political dynamics and social division, polarized voting base. Society is deeply divided, and polarized voters often rally behind strong, uncompromising figures. Echo chambers and social media. Social media algorithms amplify echo chambers where like-minded people reinforce each other's views, encouraging loyalty to polarizing leaders. Populism and disillusionment. Frustration with traditional politics can lead to the rise of populist leaders who promise drastic change. Charisma and communication style. Charismatic, direct communication appeals to many, particularly those who feel ignored by traditional politicians. Media sensationalism. Media coverage often sensationalizes controversial figures, giving them visibility and influence. Anti-establishment sentiment. Many feel the political establishment is corrupt or ineffective, making them open to alternative candidates. Perceived strength. People often associate a strongman approach with effective leadership, especially in uncertain times. Nostalgia and nationalism. Campaigns promising a return to a better time can be appealing during periods of social change. Rejection of political correctness. Some voters reject what they see as overly restrictive cultural norms and see a controversial leader as a way to push back. Economic anxiety. Economic challenges lead people to support leaders promising job security and financial reform. Let's review some of the psychological and social factors. When it comes to choosing leaders, we like to think we're rational, objective, but dig a little deeper and you'll find that our choices are often shaped less by logic than by the mental shortcuts we've come to rely on. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the way we support divisive figures. Take cognitive bias, for instance. We're all prone to confirmation bias, that sneaky mental filter that allows us to see only what we want to see and ignore what doesn't fit. Once we decide someone's on our side, we're more likely to brush aside their flaws. It's as if we've invested in a particular worldview, and seeing it challenged feels personal. Every misstep or scandal becomes easier to ignore if we're already convinced our chosen leader is part of our team. Then there's the pull of group identity. Humans are tribal creatures by nature, and belonging to a group gives us a sense of purpose, strength, and security. Divisive leaders tap into this, drawing lines that make us feel like we're part of something bigger, something vital. Supporting a polarizing leader isn't just about the leader themselves, it's about reinforcing our identity, aligning with people who feel the same way we do, and in an increasingly fragmented world, that unity feels priceless. And let's talk about fear of change. Rapid shifts in society can feel like the ground beneath us is constantly moving. We crave stability, familiarity. Leaders who promise to restore things to the way they used to be appeal to that longing, that nostalgia. They offer the reassurance that they'll protect us from a world that feels less and less like the one we grew up in. Some of us even have a built-in preference for authoritarianism. It sounds extreme, but many people are drawn to leaders who project strength, who appear firm and decisive. When the world seems chaotic, a leader who cuts through the noise and tells us they have a plan can feel like an anchor. They're not here to negotiate, they're here to command, and that certainty is deeply appealing in times of doubt. Then there's moral disengagement, the ability to separate a leader's actions from our own values if we believe there's a greater good at stake. If a leader seems to be fighting for a cause we believe in, we may overlook things we'd otherwise find unacceptable. It's a mental balancing act, a way to prioritize what we think really matters. Projection is another fascinating phenomenon. We tend to see our leaders as extensions of our own values, viewing their decisions through the lens of what we believe. We project our ideals onto them, interpreting their actions to align with our own beliefs. If they're saying things we agree with, we assume they must share our values, even if the evidence is shaky. And after a while, we all become a little desensitized. The first scandal shocks us, the second surprises us, but by the fifth, it's just part of the routine. Controversial leaders know this. They're aware that with time, the public's tolerance increases, and the same actions that might have caused outrage in the beginning barely register anymore. Then there's the need for certainty. In turbulent times, complexity and nuance can feel exhausting. Many people crave straightforward solutions, even if they're oversimplified. This is where leaders who speak in clear, relatable language come in, offering the kind of black and white clarity that's easy to grasp and feels comforting in a world full of shades of grey. Ultimately, fear and insecurity play massive roles. When we feel vulnerable, be it socially, economically, or physically, we naturally gravitate toward figures who promise to protect us. Leaders who acknowledge these fears and position themselves as defenders against a dangerous, unpredictable world seem not only appealing but essential. In the end, it's not one thing but a mosaic of psychological forces that come together, shaping our preferences in ways we might not even recognize. Under stress, under fear, in a world where every headline feels like a new crisis, we lean toward those who make us feel secure, validated, understood. And often, these are the very leaders who polarize us the most, giving us exactly what we think we need, even if the reality is far more complicated. Psychological factors, including cognitive biases, group identity, and fear, often shape people's choices, especially under stress, leading them to support strong, divisive figures. Let's examine some of these. People are often influenced by cognitive biases such as confirmation bias, leading them to dismiss flaws in leaders they already support. Group identity and tribalism. Strong group identities can make people rally behind divisive leaders to reinforce their social identity. Fear of change. Rapid social changes make people nostalgic for the past, favoring leaders who promise stability. Authoritarian personality. Some people have a psychological preference for authoritarian leaders who appear decisive and strong. Moral disengagement. People can overlook unethical behavior in leaders if they believe it serves a greater good. Projection of personal values. Voters often project their values onto leaders, interpreting actions in ways that fit their personal beliefs. Desensitization to controversy. People become desensitized to scandals over time, making it easier for controversial leaders to maintain support. Need for certainty. In uncertain times, people may prioritize certainty and security over nuanced policy positions. Simplicity and relatability. Straightforward, relatable language can appeal to people, making them feel understood. Fear and insecurity. Fear of social, economic, or security threats can make people support leaders who promise to protect them. Economic concerns. In the tumult of modern life, few things feel as personal or as pressing as economic security. When jobs vanish, wages stall, and communities change, the appeal of a leader promising economic protectionism grows powerful. People crave stability, a sense of reassurance that their jobs, their homes, their way of life will be safeguarded. And when that stability is threatened, we seek leaders who tell us they'll protect what's ours, who promise they'll put a stop to the forces that seem so far out of our control. Take globalization. For years, we've been told it's the way forward, an unstoppable tide lifting all boats. But for some, it doesn't feel that way. Instead, globalization has meant the shuttering of factories, the disappearance of industries that once defined whole communities. Local businesses struggle against international giants, and the familiar faces of our hometowns are replaced by something unrecognizable. In this climate, a leader who pledges to pull back from the global economy to bring jobs home doesn't just seem practical, they seem like a savior. And there's a deeper wound here, income inequality. It's not just that people are struggling, it's that they can see who isn't. The gap between those with unimaginable wealth and those barely scraping by grows wider every year, and with it comes resentment, frustration, and, eventually, a demand for change. Leaders who address this stark divide and who promise drastic, even radical, economic reform resonate powerfully with people who feel left behind. Then there's a widespread distrust of financial elites. Many believe that while everyday people suffered through recessions and economic downturns, a small circle of the wealthy and well-connected thrived. The big banks were bailed out, everyday people were not. This sense of betrayal lingers, and it fuels a desire for leaders who aren't afraid to call out those at the top, to name the unfairness, and to stand against it. These feelings are compounded by an overwhelming loss of social status. Economies don't just shape paychecks, they shape identity. In an era where economic shifts have erased the pride tied to certain jobs or industries, people feel a loss not just of income but of respect, of dignity. They want a leader who promises a return to better times, to an era where their work was valued and their communities thrived. And perhaps most unsettling is the sense of a decline in social mobility. When the ladder to success feels out of reach, when people feel stuck in the same place no matter how hard they work, the desire for structural change intensifies. They want leaders who see these barriers and pledge to tear them down, promising that upward mobility won't remain a relic of the past. But the reality is complex. Wealthy donors and financial backers often play a role in the rise of polarizing leaders. With deep pockets, these supporters can amplify the voices of those who promise drastic change, aligning their own interests with the fears and hopes of the public. Sometimes it's those very financial elites, frustrated with the system, who help push an anti-establishment leader to the forefront. There's also the grinding issue of job insecurity in key industries. As automation and technological advances make certain jobs obsolete, entire regions once buoyed by a single industry, mining, manufacturing, even retail, find themselves in economic freefall. A leader who speaks to these communities, who promises to revive and protect these industries, draws passionate support. For these voters, the stakes couldn't be higher. It's not just about employment, but about survival. And then, looming over everything, is the rising cost of living. Housing, healthcare, food. When essentials feel out of reach, people need relief. They need solutions, not platitudes. And any leader who speaks directly to this daily struggle, who promises to lower costs and improve access, finds an audience that's both desperate and hopeful. All of these forces, income inequality, distrust in elites, job insecurity, the cost of living, paint a picture of an anxious, restless population. And this is why so many are drawn to leaders who don't just propose incremental changes, but who promise radical economic reform. It's a cry for a new kind of security, a new kind of fairness, and a sense of stability in an increasingly unstable world. For many, that's worth the risk of embracing the controversial, the unconventional. It's not just about economics, it's about the lives they're fighting to reclaim. Economic factors such as income inequality, globalization, and economic insecurity often lead people to support leaders who promise radical financial reform and protectionism. Let's look at some of these. Leaders who focus on cost of living issues may attract those feeling financial pressure. Economic protectionism. Policies promising economic protectionism can attract people worried about job losses and globalization. Income inequality. Rising inequality can lead people to seek out leaders promising drastic economic changes. Desire for economic security. In tough economic times, people prioritize leaders who promise jobs and financial stability. Frustration with globalization. Some see globalization as threatening local industries, leading them to support leaders promising to reverse these trends. Distrust in financial elites. Many feel distrust toward financial elites and support leaders who appear to stand up to them. Perceived loss of social status. Economic shifts can create a sense of lost social status, leading to support for leaders who promise a return to better times. Decline in social mobility. When people feel they lack upward mobility, they may support leaders promising structural change. Influence of wealthy donors. Wealthy supporters can provide the resources to amplify the messages of polarizing leaders. Job insecurity in key industries. Leaders addressing the decline of key industries can attract dedicated supporters. Rising cost of living. Leaders who focus on cost of living issues may attract those feeling financial pressure. Institutional and governance issues. In a world where promises of order and progress ring hollow, the cracks in our political institutions are glaring, and for many, they're unforgivable. The structures we once trusted to represent and protect us now feel like endless webs of dysfunction. It's no wonder, then, that the more these institutions falter, the more people feel drawn to the loudest voice calling for change, even if it's unconventional, even if it's polarizing. Our political institutions feel weak, mired in inefficiency and paralyzed by infighting. When every decision seems tied up in endless debate and red tape, when urgent issues are left to gather dust, a controversial figure starts to look less like a risk and more like the only option. People are hungry for leaders who say they'll bulldoze through the inertia, cut through the noise, and bring about the change these aging systems seem incapable of delivering. Then there's the sheer ineffectiveness of government. People aren't blind. They see the inability to solve basic issues, the waste, the grand promises that yield so little. They watch as potholes remain unfilled, healthcare remains unaffordable, and policies grow ever more complex but less impactful. In the face of this incompetence, an outsider promising to clean house, to start fresh, can feel like a lifeline. And bureaucracy, that grinding machinery of paperwork and protocols that swallows progress whole. For anyone who's ever waited in endless lines or lost days navigating a sea of forms, the call to drain the swamp resonates deeply. It's not just rhetoric, it's a promise of liberation from the endless waiting and the hopelessness that bureaucracy breeds. There's a gnawing sense that accountability has vanished, that those in power can make sweeping mistakes, even harm the very people they serve, and walk away unscathed. When people feel like no one at the top has to answer for their actions, when scandal after scandal goes unpunished, the desire for a leader who will hold others to account is powerful. It's why outsiders, those who claim they owe nothing to the political machinery, seem trustworthy. And let's talk about overcomplexity. Policies are wrapped in layers of jargon and technicalities, so detached from everyday life that people can't even follow what's going on. Simple, direct promises cut through this noise, offering the appeal of clarity over complexity. People want a leader who speaks in plain terms, someone who seems to understand their frustrations and isn't lost in policy minutiae. And then there's the failure of the judicial system. For those who have watched cases fall apart, victims receive no justice, or powerful individuals walk free, the legal system itself can feel like it's designed to fail. Leaders who promise strict reforms, who talk about real, sweeping changes to this broken system, appeal to those who've lost faith in the courts. Elite interests seem to dominate every decision. People see the connections, the quiet meetings, the policies that seem to favor the rich while leaving ordinary people behind. When politics appears rigged in favor of the elite, anti-establishment leaders appear to be a radical but necessary antidote. They're the only ones, it seems, willing to speak truth to power, to serve the public instead of the privileged few. The electoral system itself has its flaws: gerrymandering, voter suppression, every little crack that makes it feel like the whole thing is a game with rules that don't favor the average citizen. When even the election process seems skewed, is it any surprise people turn to the candidates who say they'll tear it all down and start again? Then there's the transparency issue. Government moves behind closed doors with decisions affecting millions made with no public insight. In this shadowy world of secrecy, people crave openness, raw honesty, qualities that anti-establishment leaders promise in spades. Transparency becomes the dream, a way out of the opacity that defines politics as we know it. And finally, there's corporate influence. When corporations seem to control politicians like marionettes, influencing laws that affect the rest of us, voters feel alienated, disregarded, and even betrayed. They want leaders who aren't indebted to big money, who promise to break the grip of corporate interests and give power back to the people. In the end, it's a perfect storm. Every institutional flaw, every unchecked injustice, every hidden influence fuels the hunger for a leader who isn't afraid to take a wrecking ball to the whole thing. When people look around and see a system that doesn't represent them, doesn't serve them, doesn't even see them, a controversial figure with bold promises seems like the only choice. This isn't just about electing a person. It's about electing a symbol of defiance, a refusal to settle for a broken system, dissatisfaction with institutions, perceived inefficiency, and a lack of accountability can make controversial leaders seem like viable alternatives to existing governance. Let's have a look at some of these reasons why. Influence of corporate interests over politics can alienate voters, driving them toward alternative leaders. Dysfunction in political institutions can make controversial figures seem like the only option for change. Ineffectiveness of government. Widespread perception of government inefficiency drives people to seek alternative leaders. Dissatisfaction with bureaucracy. Red tape and bureaucracy can push people to support leaders promising to drain the swamp. Lack of accountability. People may feel that existing political systems lack accountability, turning to outsider candidates. Overcomplexity of policy. Complicated policies can make simple, direct promises more appealing. Judicial system failures. People frustrated by legal system failures may seek leaders promising strict reforms, overrepresentation of elite interests. When people feel politics serves only the elite, they may support anti-establishment leaders. Dysfunctional electoral systems. Issues like gerrymandering or voter suppression can skew results in favor of certain candidates. Transparency deficits. Lack of government transparency makes people trust anti-establishment leaders. Corporate influence. Influence of corporate interests over politics can alienate voters, driving them toward alternative leaders.